So today we are continuing our series where we're looking through Old Testament stories that we might have heard in Sunday school and exploring them in a new way. Today we're going to look at the life of Abraham, and this is going to be no mean feat, as this story fills up about 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. So I'm going to set the scene, and then we're going to focus on one particular story in Abraham's life. So starting in Genesis 12 then, we find Abram, who's not called Abraham at this point. God changes his name later on. He's living with his family in a place called Haran, which is located near the border of Turkey and Syria. And we know from genealogies in Genesis 11 that he was a 10th generation descendant of Noah. So it's about 400 years after Noah. Abram is 75 years old when God speaks to him and promises to make his descendants into a great nation. God tells him to move and leave behind everything he knows and go to a land that God will show him. In Genesis 12, the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram had to trust God and be obedient. He took with him his wife and his servants and their families and all his livestock, plus his nephew Lot and his full household and all of his animals. So there were a lot of people and a lot of animals. It was a long journey to the land of Canaan, about 1,000 miles, and travelling on foot with so many people and so many animals would have taken a long time. Now, for the next 10 years, Abram and his family live in the area of Canaan as nomads. They live in tents and move from place to place to find food for themselves and for their animals. And at one point, they have to move to Egypt because of a famine. And during this time, it appears that an Egyptian maidservant called Hagar joins the family. Now, at some time during that 10-year period, God again spoke to Abram and renewed his promise to him. In Genesis 15 it says, "Sometime later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great.' But Abram replied, 'O sovereign God, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir.' Then the Lord said to him, 'No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own, who will be your heir.' Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, 'Look up into the sky and count the stars, if you can. That's how many descendants you will have.' And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." So we're told that Abram trusted God. He believed that God would give him a son, and everything seemed to be going really well. Abram was becoming wealthy, and he had a good relationship with God. But he still didn't have an heir. And even though we are told that he believed God's promise, he now decides to take the situation into his own hands. We're told that Sarai, his wife, makes the suggestion that he should sleep with her servant Hagar so that he can have a child through her. Now, this might seem to us like a really inappropriate suggestion. But this was quite common in those days because it was important to have a large family. And we see this same practice of polygamy in several of the families in the Old Testament. Jacob, for example, had 2 wives, Leah and Rebekah, and he also had children via their maidservants. And these children later became the heads of the tribes of Israel. Nowhere in the Bible are the actions of these men condemned by God. It was just the way things were at the time. These women were part of the family, and part of their responsibility appears to be to bear children. So the story continues. Abram agrees with this plan suggested by Sarai. He sleeps with Hagar and she becomes pregnant. But we're told that when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. So the situation causes tension between Hagar and Sarai. Hagar feels superior to Sarai because she's bearing her master's child, and Sarai is unable to do so. And this is made worse by the fact that in those days, a woman's value was wrapped up in her ability to bear children. Now, because of the way Hagar was acting, Sarai then treats Hagar very harshly, and Hagar eventually runs away into the desert. While Hagar's hiding in the desert, an angel comes to her and tells her to name her child Ishmael. The angel also gives her a prophecy, and she's told that her son will be wild and violent and be an enemy to his relatives. So now at this point in the story, Abram is now 86 years old, and it's 11 years since he was called by God. The next time we pick up the story is 13 years later. Hagar and Ishmael are back living as part of Abram's family. And we're going to jump now to Genesis 17. It says this: When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you, by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. At this, Abram fell face down on the ground. Then God said to him, This is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you, from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you, and I will give the entire land of Canaan, where you're now living as a foreigner, to you and your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. And then it continues in verse 15. Then God said to Abraham, regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai, for her name will now be Sarah. And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. Then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100, he thought, and how can Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? So Abraham said to God, May Ishmael live under your special blessing. But God replied, No. Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac. And I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked. I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. When God had finished speaking, he left Abraham. So now it is 24 years since Abraham was called by God, and he's now 99 years of age. God again promises that he'll make him into a great nation. And God reinforces his promise by changing their names. Abram becomes Abraham. The meaning of his name changes from great father to father of a great nation. Again, that same year, we are told in Genesis 18 that the Lord appeared again to Abraham and told him this: I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. This was Sarah's response. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old? Then the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, Can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Now notice that both Sarah and Abraham laughed when God tells them that they'll have a son. They didn't laugh years earlier when God made his promise to Abram that he would have many descendants. 24 years have gone by, and God's promise has not been fulfilled. Abraham and his wife are getting older, and so it seems to them even less likely that they would have a child. But God had never told them when his plan would come about, and God had not told them how it would happen either. God's initial promises to Abram were more general. First, God promised, I will make you into a great nation. You will have a multitude of descendants. Then some years later, God renewed his promise and told Abraham, saying, You will have your own son and heir. But God didn't mention who would be the mother of that child. Sarah wasn't mentioned in God's promise until 24 years later, 24 years after the original promise was given out. Only a short time before God's promise was about to be fulfilled did God fill them in on the detail of his plan. When God changed their names, he then revealed to them that Sarah would have a child, and it would be within a year. When they heard God's full plan, they laughed. It was impossible. By that time, they were 89 and 99 years old. Now, many of the people who lived in Old Testament times did live a lot longer than people do today, but that is pushing it. So now we have the story. What can we learn from it? I've got 5 points. Okay, so my first point is God knows the plans he has for us. In Jeremiah 29:11 it says, For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. If God has a plan for us, he also has the ability to bring about that plan. Not only that, he also knows the perfect timing for that plan. And if we try and force things to happen in our way, with our timing, it's likely to fail. Abraham and Sarah knew that God intended for them to have many descendants. So after many years of waiting for God to do it his way and seeing no results, they took matters into their own hands. And can we blame them? But this can be a very good reason why God might not tell us the plans that he has for us. Because like Abraham and Sarah, we tend to want to take control and do things our way. Once we know the plan, we're eager to get on with it, to carry it out. And waiting patiently for God's timing isn't easy. And this takes us on to point number 2. Waiting for God's promises requires trust and patience. So now I want to tell you a story about Pete Gregg. Pete is founder of the 24/7 prayer movement, which was founded in 1999. Some years ago, Pete felt God was telling him that they needed a headquarters, somewhere where the leaders and members from all over the world could gather, a centre of operations. But when God told him this, he also asked Pete if he wanted to organise it himself or he wanted a miracle. And Pete said, a miracle. So he waited, and he waited, and he waited. 13 years later, just last year, through a number of amazing coincidences, the opportunity arose to set up a headquarters for the 24/7 prayer movement at Waverley Abbey House. This has been the home of CWR, a Christian counselling and retreat centre, for many years. It's an amazing building. It has an amazing heritage in prayer. It's very close to Pete's home and to his church. And with it came the opportunity to partner with the people who were already working for the CWR organisation. Now, God's plan took time, but when it came about, it far exceeded anything that Pete could have ever hoped for or imagined. Now, as an aside, I've got a bit of a soft spot for Waverley Abbey House. I went there for a few days for one of their counselling courses several years ago. I had a great time. But some months later, after my visit, I had a sudden phone call from my sister, who was at the New Wine camp in Somerset, saying this: "What is your face doing on this brochure?" Well, I was as shocked as she was. They'd been taking publicity shots for CWR while we were on the course, and we were all asked to sign a permission form for them to use our photos if we ended up in one of the shots. However, I never expected to end up zoomed in on the front cover. So then, moving on to my third point, forcing things to happen will have negative consequences. Now, initially, Abraham and Sarah did trust God and wait on him, but over the years, their trust and patience ran out. So they took matters into their own hands, and the outcome was not entirely positive. In our story, Hagar gave birth to a son called Ishmael, and the prophecy given by the angel said this: "This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives." Ishmael's descendants became enemies of Isaac's descendants. In the Bible, we see the Ishmaelites, who are Ishmael's descendants, are enemies of Israel, who are Isaac's descendants. Many Arab people today are descendants of Ishmael, and many Arab nations are enemies of Israel. Abraham and Sarah's decision to bring about God's plan in their own way had very serious and ongoing repercussions. So point number 4, with God, all things are possible. In Matthew 19:26, it says this: "With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible." When Abraham and Sarah heard God's plan, they laughed. Having a child when they were 90 and 100 years old wasn't possible. Do you remember how Elizabeth's husband, Zachariah, didn't believe God's plan for his wife to become pregnant because she was too old? And God stopped him from being able to speak because he didn't believe the plan. God's plans may well sound outrageous and impossible to us, but we mustn't forget that with God, all things are possible. God makes the rules, after all. And another very important point here is, don't write yourself off because of your age. Age is no obstacle for God. And finally, there has to be a balance between inaction and overaction When God makes a promise or gives you a vision, it often isn't appropriate just to sit back and wait for God to act. He does expect us to step out in faith based on what he's told us. For example, Moses had to hold up his staff and stretch his hand out over the water before the sea parted. And in Joshua 3, we're told that when the people were crossing the Jordan River, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant actually had to step into the water before the Jordan stopped flowing. Action by people was required in both cases before God would act. And we're told in Matthew 7:7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. Each of these instructions requires an action from us. Ask, seek, knock, and then the thing will happen. And notice it says knock and it will be opened to you. It doesn't say force the door open with a crowbar. So we need to move in the direction that God points us and keep praying that God will open up the way ahead. But we mustn't keep pushing ahead if God is closing the doors. And knowing the difference takes discernment, and that requires prayer. So what we should do, we should prepare, train, and learn for whatever God is calling us to do, but wait for God's clear instruction on when and how to act. In Proverbs 3, we're told, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. And that is very good advice. Seek his will before we act. And if Abraham had taken that advice, a whole lot of trouble could have been avoided. So to conclude, God tends to reveal his plans to us one step at a time. He gives us the information and the contacts we need just at the right time. He doesn't tell us everything in advance, and now I understand why. Our tendency would be, like Abraham and Sarah, to head off at our own pace and in our own way to try and carry out his plan. But his plans need to be carried out in his way and according to his timing. Like Pete, if we want a miracle, we've got to be prepared to wait for it. And I just want to conclude with the words from Psalm 27 that we started with. I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. We need to trust God and be patient if we're going to wait for God's timing. So now we're going to listen to a song which uses these words from Psalm 27. I'm confident of this, that I will see your goodness in the land of the living. And the opening lyrics really speak of how Abraham and Sarah must have felt after years of waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled in their lives. It says, Lord, every dream and all I've hoped for, the promises you've spoken over me, I hold in faith, they're not forgotten, in spite of what I feel or what I see. And I'm choosing to believe, and your words are enough for me. Let's listen.